The blizzard outside the farmhouse in rural Minnesota was relentless. It was the kind of storm that buried secrets under 6 feet of snow, turning the world into a blank, silent canvas. But inside the Anderson home, the silence was about to be shattered by a voice that had been dead for 70 years. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve. The fire in the hearth crackled with a comforting warmth, casting dancing shadows against the rustic wooden walls. Clara Anderson sat on the plush rug, watching her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, play with her new gift, a small, toy, grand piano. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the window panes in their frames. But Clara felt safe. She felt secure. She had no idea that the safety of her domestic life was hanging by a thread, about to be severed by the tiny fingers of her own child. Lily had always been a quiet child. She was introspective, preferring the company of shadows to other children. She spoke late, walked late, and often stared into the middle distance as if watching a movie only she could see. But tonight, something was different. As Lily tapped the plastic keys of the toy piano, her rhythm shifted. She wasn't banging on the keys like a toddler. She was finding a melody. It started slow, a melancholic, bluesy progression that sounded jarringly sophisticated coming from a toy. Plink, plink, hum. Clara lowered her book, a frown creasing her forehead. "That's a pretty song, Lily. Where did you hear that?" Lily didn't answer. She didn't even look up. Her head was tilted to the side, her eyes squeezed shut, her body swaying with a mature, languid grace that looked grotesque on a 6-year-old. She began to hum. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It was a low, smoky jazz tune, filled with a sorrow that spoke of whiskey, cigarettes, and heartbreak, things a kindergartner knew nothing about. Then, Lily opened her mouth and sang. "The velvet rope is tied too tight. The blue smoke hides the losing fight." Clara froze. The lyrics were haunting, delivered not in Lily's high-pitched child's voice, but with a strange, breathy inflection, mimicking a sultry cabaret singer. "Lily?" Clara whispered, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. "Honey, stop! You're scaring Mommy." Lily's eyes snapped open, but they weren't Lily's eyes anymore. The innocence was gone, replaced by a terrified, frantic awareness. She looked at the Christmas tree, then at the fireplace, and finally at her mother. But she didn't see Clara. She looked through her. "He's in the dressing room!" Lily gasped, her voice trembling. "Don't let him in! The lock is broken! I told the manager the lock was broken!" Clara rushed forward, grabbing her daughter by the shoulders. "Lily! Who is in the dressing room?" Lily clawed at her own throat, her face turning a violent shade of red. She was gasping for air, choking on nothing. "The saxophone! The strap! It's too tight! Tell Johnny to stop playing! I can't breathe!" The chaos erupted instantly. Clara screamed for her husband, David, who was in the kitchen. David rushed in, dropping a tray of cookies, the porcelain shattering on the hardwood floor, a sound that mimicked the fracturing of their reality. He saw his daughter writhing on the floor, clutching her neck as if an invisible noose was tightening around it. "Call 911!" Clara shrieked, trying to pry Lily's hands away from her throat. "She's having a seizure. She can't breathe." But it wasn't a seizure. Just as David reached for his phone, Lily went rigid. The choking stopped. She sat up, her movements jerky and unnatural. She looked at David, her eyes wide with a specific adult terror. "The diamonds," Lily whispered, her voice raspy and desperate. "He didn't want the money. He wanted the Star of Midnight. I swallowed it. Tell them I swallowed it so he couldn't have it." "What?" David stammered, freezing with the phone in his hand. "Lily, what are you talking about?" Lily stood up. She walked to the window, pressing her small hand against the frosted glass, looking out into the blizzard. But she wasn't seeing the snow. She was seeing something else entirely. "It's New Year's Eve," she murmured, her voice detached. 1954. The snow is falling on 52nd Street. Can't you hear the applause? They are waiting for Cassie. But Cassie isn't coming out. Cassie is on the floor, and the red velvet curtain is getting darker. Clara and David stood paralyzed in their living room. The wind outside seemed to carry the faint, ghostly sound of a saxophone. Their daughter had just given them a date, a location, and a name. Cassie. This wasn't just a tantrum. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a dying declaration recorded on the soul of a child, playing back on a loop. Lily turned to them, tears streaming down her face. Tears that felt ancient. "He's wearing the white tuxedo," she sobbed. "The one with the blood on the cuff. He's still here. He's watching the show." The power in the farmhouse flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, Clara realized with a horror that chilled her bones. They weren't alone in the house. They were trapped with a memory so violent, so potent, that it had defied death itself to be heard. And the man in the white tuxedo? According to Lily, he was still watching. David turned on his phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. It landed on Lily. She was pointing at the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. "Don't look at him," Lily whispered. "If you look at him, he'll know you saw the diamonds." The Hendersons didn't know it yet, but their quiet life in Minnesota was over. They had just stepped into a cold case that the NYPD had closed 70 years ago. A case involving a missing jazz singer, a legendary stolen diamond, and a murderer who had vanished into the smoke of a 1950s nightclub. The investigation had begun, and their 6-year-old daughter was the only witness to a crime that happened decades before she was born. The farmhouse was silent again, but it was a brittle, fragile silence, the kind that exists in the seconds after a gunshot, before the echo fully fades. The power had flickered back on 20 minutes ago, casting a harsh, artificial light on a scene that felt fundamentally altered. Lily was asleep on the sofa, covered in a knitted afghan, her breathing shallow but rhythmic. She looked like a normal child again. The terrifying, smoky voice of the jazz singer was gone, retreated back into whatever dark recess of her mind it had crawled out from. But her parents, Clara and David, sat at the kitchen table, 2 untouched mugs of coffee growing cold between them, unable to return to the normalcy they had known just an hour ago. David, a structural engineer by trade, was a man who understood load-bearing walls and tension limits. He understood physics. He did not understand this. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his face pale. "It has to be a movie, Clara," he said, his voice straining for rationality. "She must have seen something on TV. Maybe at daycare? Kids absorb things like sponges? The Star of Midnight? That sounds like a cartoon jewel, like something from a princess movie." Clara shook her head slowly. Her hands were trembling so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim of her mug. "No, David, you didn't look at her eyes. Those weren't Lily's eyes. And the way she held her neck? She wasn't imitating a cartoon. She was reliving a trauma. She said she swallowed it. What kind of cartoon has a character swallowing a diamond to hide it from a murderer?" She pulled her laptop toward her. The screen glowed blue in the dim kitchen, a portal to a world of answers she was terrified to find. "I'm going to search for it," she whispered. "If it's a movie, I'll find the plot summary. If it's a book, I'll find the author. But if it's real?" David didn't stop her. He watched as her fingers flew across the keyboard. The wind outside battered the farmhouse, piling snow against the siding, isolating them further in their bubble of growing dread. Clara typed, "Star of Midnight Diamond Stolen." The search engine spun for a moment, processing millions of data points. Then, the results populated. Clara gasped. The sound was sharp, sucking the air out of the room. David stood up and walked behind her chair, leaning over her shoulder. There, on the screen, was a digitized archive of a New York Daily News front page. The date was January 2nd, 1955. The paper was yellowed with age, the font bold and sensationalist. Headline: Jazz Darling Vanishes on New Year's Eve. Star of Midnight. Diamond missing, presumed stolen. Beneath the headline was a black and white photograph. It showed a stunningly beautiful African-American woman standing in front of a microphone. She wore a glittering evening gown and a necklace that featured a massive dark gemstone at its center. Her eyes were heavy-lidded, sultry, and filled with a melancholic wisdom. The caption read, "Cassandra Cassie Vance, last seen at the Blue Velvet Club on 52nd Street." "Oh my God," David whispered, the skepticism draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel. "Cassie." Lily said her name was Cassie. Clara clicked on the article, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She began to read aloud, her voice wavering. "Police are baffled by the disappearance of rising jazz star Cassandra Vance. Witnesses say she retreated to her dressing room shortly before the midnight countdown. When the club manager went to retrieve her for the encore, the room was empty. There were signs of a struggle, a overturned vanity, shattered glass, and blood on the floorboards. The famous Star of Midnight diamond, a rare black diamond worth an estimated $50,000, which Vance wore for the performance, was also missing. Authorities are seeking Vance's estranged lover and saxophone player Johnny Slick Russo for questioning." Clara stopped reading. She turned to look at the sleeping form of her daughter in the living room. "Johnny," she breathed. Lily said, "Tell Johnny to stop playing." She knew the name of the saxophone player, David. How? How could a 6-year-old in Minnesota know the name of a suspect in a 1954 New York cold case? David walked over to the window, staring out into the blizzard. The reflection in the glass showed a man whose world was crumbling. Maybe we talked about it? He grasped at straws. Maybe there was a podcast, a documentary we watched? We don't listen to true crime, David, Clara snapped, fear making her sharp. And look at this detail. She pointed to the screen again. The police report says the door was forced open, but Lily screamed that the lock was broken. She said she told the manager. Clara scrolled down to a subsection of the article titled, "The Investigation Stalls." It was a small paragraph, easily overlooked. Club manager Arthur Pims testified that he had intended to fix the dressing room latch earlier that week, but had forgotten. The defense attorney for Johnny Russo argues that anyone could have entered the room. Lily knew the lock was broken before the killer entered, Clara said, her voice chillingly calm. She knew it because she was the one who complained about it. David, our daughter isn't just remembering a story. She is remembering the moment she died. Suddenly, a sound came from the living room. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping. Clara and David rushed into the room. Lily was still asleep, but she was moving. Her right hand was tapping against the wooden frame of the sofa. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same frantic rhythm as the jazz song she had hummed earlier. But then, she began to speak. Her eyes were closed, lost in the REM sleep of a nightmare, but the voice was clear. It was the husky, adult voice of Cassie Vance. "It hurts," the child whispered, clutching her stomach. "The edges are sharp. I can feel it inside me. The stone is cold." David knelt beside her. "Lily, can you hear me?" Lily's head thrashed to the side. "He thinks I hid it in the vase. He's smashing the perfume bottles. I can hear the glass breaking. But I swallowed it, Johnny. You'll never find it. You'll have to cut me open to get it." David recoiled in horror. The imagery was too visceral, too violent. "Wake her up, Clara. Wake her up right now." "Wait," Clara said, grabbing David's arm. She was terrified, but her maternal instinct had shifted into something predatory. She needed to know the truth to save her child. She leaned close to Lily's ear. "Cassie," she whispered. "Cassie, where are you now? Where did Johnny take you?" It was a dangerous question. They were inviting a ghost to speak. Lily stopped thrashing. She became eerily still. A small smile touched her lips. A sad, resigned smile that didn't belong on a child's face. "The snow is warm," Lily murmured. "Why is the snow warm?" "Oh, it's the steam. The grate. We are under the street now. The trains are loud. He's putting me in the wall. Behind the bricks. The mortar smells wet." She paused, and then delivered the detail that would turn this from a paranormal curiosity into an active crime scene investigation. "Number 4, Lily whispered. "Track 4. The workman left a gap in the tiles. That's where I sleep, with the rats. And the diamond is still inside me. It's my heart now, a black heart for a blue girl." Lily let out a long, shuddering sigh and went limp, falling into a deep, natural sleep. The room was silent again, but the air felt charged with electricity. David stood up, his face ashen. He looked at Clara. "Track 4, he repeated. "She's talking about the subway, or a tunnel." "The Blue Velvet Club was on 52nd Street, Clara said, her mind racing, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. "That's near the subway lines. If Johnny Russo killed her in the dressing room, he had to dispose of the body. He didn't take her out the front door. He took her down." Clara went back to the computer. She searched for Johnny Russo saxophone player. The results were grim. Russo had been arrested but acquitted due to lack of evidence. A body was never found. The Star of Midnight diamond was never recovered. Johnny Russo had died in a nursing home in Yonkers in 2001, claiming his innocence until his last breath. "He got away with it," David said, a surge of anger replacing his fear. "He killed her, hid her in a subway tunnel wall, and lived his whole life free. And now he's dead." "But the diamond isn't," Clara said, staring at the screen. "And neither is Cassie. She's in our living room, David. She's back because she wants to be found. She wants the diamond to be found." Clara turned to her husband. The skepticism was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grim determination. They both knew that their normal life in Minnesota was over. They couldn't send Lily back to kindergarten on Monday. They couldn't pretend this didn't happen. Every time Lily closed her eyes, she was suffocating in a wall in 1954. "I'm booking tickets to New York," David said, his voice steady for the first time that night. first flight in the morning. We need to find that tunnel. If Lily knows exactly where she is buried, then we are going to find her. We can't just walk into a subway tunnel with a shovel, David, Clara warned, though she was already mentally packing their bags. No, David said, looking at the sleeping child. We're not going alone. I have a friend at the NYPD, an old college buddy in the cold case unit. I'm going to call him. I don't care if he thinks I'm crazy. I'm going to tell him that a dead woman just told me where her body is. Outside, the storm finally began to break. The wind died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating blanket of snow over the world. But inside the Anderson house, the heat was rising. They had a lead, they had a name, and they had a map, drawn in the nightmares of a 6-year-old girl. The rising action was complete. Now, they were moving toward the conflict, a confrontation not with a living killer, but with the concrete and steel of New York City itself. New York City did not welcome the Anderson family with open arms. It swallowed them whole. From the moment their taxi emerged from the Lincoln Tunnel, the assault on their senses was absolute. For David and Clara, the noise was just the cacophony of a metropolis. Sirens, jackhammers, the endless drone of traffic. But for 6-year-old Lily, it was a war zone. She sat in the back seat, her hands clamped firmly over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She wasn't blocking out the sounds of 2024. She was trying to block out the overlapping echoes of 1954. Every time the car idled near a storm drain, she would gag, complaining of the smell of stale perfume and copper, the scent of the dressing room where Cassie Vance had drawn her last breath. They checked into a hotel in Midtown, but there was no time to rest. The clock was ticking, not just on their trip, but on Lily's sanity. David had arranged a meeting with his old college roommate, Mark Harrigan, who was now a detective second grade in the NYPD cold case squad. It was a favor called in at the highest level of friendship, a desperate Hail Mary pass. The precinct was a grim, fluorescent-lit labyrinth of desks and tired faces. Detective Harrigan met them in a small interrogation room, not out of malice, but for privacy. He was a man worn down by the weight of unsolved murders, his face etched with lines of cynicism. He listened to David's story without interrupting, drumming his fingers on a thick manila folder. When David finished explaining about the jazz song, the broken lock, and the diamond swallowed in a moment of panic, Harrigan didn't speak for a long time. "Dave," Harrigan said finally, his voice heavy with pity. "You know how this sounds, right? You want me to get a warrant to excavate a subway tunnel wall based on the fact that your 6-year-old daughter hummed a tune?" "It's not just a tune, Mark," David argued, leaning across the metal table, his desperation palpable. "She knew about the lock, the broken latch. That detail was buried in a subreport from 1955. It wasn't in the papers. How could she know that?" Harrigan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Coincidence. Lucky guess. Look, I pulled the Vance file like you asked. It's a mess. Johnny Russo was the prime suspect, sure. But we searched that club top to bottom. We searched the sewers. We searched the river. Nothing. The case is closed because everyone involved is dead. Digging up the subway system? The MTA would laugh me out of the room. It requires shutdowns, structural engineers, millions of dollars. I can't do it based on a feeling." "It's not a feeling," Clara snapped, speaking for the first time. She pulled Lily forward. The child looked small and fragile in the harsh light. "Ask her. Just ask her one question." Harrigan looked at the little girl. He softened slightly. "Hey there, sweetie. I'm Detective Harrigan. Your dad says you like music." Lily looked up. Her eyes were glazed, distant. She didn't see a detective. She saw a threat. "You're wearing the wrong tie," she whispered, her voice slipping into that husky adult timbre that made the hair on Harrigan's arms stand up. Detective O'Malley wore a brown tie. He smelled like rye whiskey. He questioned Johnny for 3 hours, but he didn't check the saxophone case. Why didn't he check the case? Harrigan froze. He slowly opened the manila folder in front of him. He flipped through the yellowed typewritten pages until he found the original interrogation log from January 1st, 1955. The interviewing officer was listed as Detective Thomas O'Malley, and in the notes, buried in a handwritten margin, was a scribbled complaint about O'Malley's conduct. Subject Russo claims officer smelled of alcohol. Harrigan looked up, his face pale. How does she know O'Malley's name?" "Because she was there," David said, pressing his advantage. "Mark, please. She says she's in the wall. Track 4, near the 50th Street station. Just take us there. If she's faking, nothing will happen. But if she reacts, you have to help us." The conflict in the room was palpable. the clash between logic and the impossible. Harrigan closed the file. He looked at the trembling child, then at his old friend. "Off the books," Harrigan muttered. "We go down there as civilians. If she freaks out, we leave, and you never ask me for anything again." The descent into the 50th Street subway station was like walking into the throat of a beast. The air was thick, humid, and smelled of ozone and ancient steel dust. It was late morning, so the platform wasn't packed, but the rumble of the trains vibrated in their teeth. As they moved deeper underground, Lily's demeanor changed terrifyingly. She stopped walking. Her body went rigid, her spine snapping straight as if pulled by a string. "It's loud," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "The steam pipe. It's hissing." He dragged me past the steam pipe. "We're on the platform, Lily," Clara whispered, holding her hand tightly. "We're safe." "No!" Lily screamed, the sound echoing off the tiled walls, drawing stares from commuters. She yanked her hand away and ran toward the edge of the platform. "He's putting me in! He's putting me in!" David lunged, grabbing her just before the yellow safety line. But Lily wasn't trying to jump on the tracks. She was pointing across them. She was pointing at the dark, grime-covered wall on the opposite side, where the local track ran. "There!" she shrieked, her voice tearing with raw agony. "The third arch! The bricks are different! He used the wrong mortar! It's gray, not black! Can't you see it? I'm behind the gray mortar!" Harrigan stared at the wall. To the naked eye, it was just a filthy expanse of century-old tunnel. But he squinted, pulling a high-powered flashlight from his belt, something he carried out of habit. He shone the beam across the tracks, cutting through the gloom. The light hit the third archway. The wall looked solid, covered in decades of soot. But under the intense LED beam, there was a subtle difference. The grout lines between a section of bricks were slightly lighter, slightly more jagged than the surrounding masonry. It was a repair job, a hasty one. "He mixed it himself," Lily moaned, collapsing into David's arms, her energy rapidly fading. "He was crying. Johnny was crying while he walled me in. He said he loved me. He said I would be the heart of the city forever." The station began to rumble. A train was approaching. The noise was deafening, a metallic scream that mirrored the terror in Lily's eyes. She covered her ears and curled into a fetal position on the dirty platform floor. "The diamond is burning me," she sobbed. "It's cold and it's burning. Please take it out. Take it out of my stomach." Harrigan stood motionless as the train roared into the station, the wind whipping his coat. He looked at the wall, then at the broken child. The conflict was no longer about whether to believe them. The conflict was now about what he was willing to risk. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call his sergeant. He called the emergency services unit. "This is Detective Harrigan, badge number 4922, he shouted over the noise of the train doors opening. "I have a potential structural hazard on the C line, 51st Street Station, northbound track. Possible unauthorized masonry work concealing biological evidence. I need a shutdown. Now. Yes, I said now." He hung up and looked at David. "You better be right, Dave, because if we tear that wall down and find nothing but rats, my career is over. And your daughter. She's going to need a lot more than a psychiatrist." The die was cast. The conflict had escalated from a family's nightmare to a citywide incident. They stood on the precipice of discovery, staring at a tomb that had been sealed for 70 years, while the rush-hour crowd bustled around them, oblivious to the jazz singer screaming silently from behind the bricks. The silence that fell over the 50th Street station was unnatural. The third rail had been killed, the power cut to the entire C line. The hum of the ventilation fans died down, leaving a stillness that felt heavy, pressurized, and suffocating. The station had been evacuated of commuters, replaced by a grim assembly of men in hard hats, emergency service unit officers, and a structural engineering team from the MTA, who looked furious to be there. Detective Harrigan stood by the yellow caution tape, wiping sweat from his forehead. His career hung in the balance of the next 10 minutes. The MTA foreman, a burly man named Kovac, approached him with a sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. "You realize what this is costing the city, Harrigan?" Kovac spat, gesturing to the silent tracks. "We're shutting down midday service for a hunch. If there's nothing behind that wall but rats and old conduit pipes, you're going to be directing traffic in Staten Island until you retire." Harrigan didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked over at the bench where Clara and David sat, holding Lily. The child was no longer screaming. She was shivering violently, her eyes fixed on the third archway across the tracks. She was murmuring a low, mournful melody, the same jazz tune she had hummed in Minnesota, but now it sounded like a dirge. "He's putting the last brick in," Lily whispered, her voice echoing in the dead station. "It's dark now. I can't see the light anymore. Goodbye, Johnny. Goodbye, New York." "Start," Harrigan ordered, his voice cracking slightly. "Tear it down." Two ESU officers jumped down onto the trackbed, their boots crunching on the gravel. They approached the section of the wall Lily had pointed to, the section with the slightly lighter, gray mortar. They set up portable floodlights, bathing the grimy bricks in a blinding white glare. The first blow of the sledgehammer sounded like a gunshot. Crack. Lily flinched, burying her face in her father's coat. Crack! Crack! The masonry was old, but the repair work Johnny Russo had done in panic 70 years ago was inferior. The bricks began to loosen. Dust, black with decades of brake dust and steel filings, billowed out into the stagnant air. "It's hollow," one of the officers shouted, pausing mid-swing. The sound changed. "There's a cavity behind here. It's not a structural column." Harrigan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the subway's damp air. "Keep going," he yelled. "Open it up." The officers switched to pry bars. They wedged the steel tips into the crumbling mortar. With a collective grunt of effort, they heaved. A large section of the brickwork gave way, tumbling onto the tracks with a heavy, wet thud. A draft of air escaped from the hole, a puff of stagnant, ancient atmosphere that had been sealed away since the Eisenhower administration. It carried a smell that made the hardened MTA workers step back, covering their noses. It wasn't the smell of rotting garbage. It was the sweet, cloying, unmistakable scent of mummification, mixed with the faint, chemical ghost of expensive perfume. Chanel No. 5. Harrigan jumped down onto the tracks. He grabbed a flashlight and approached the jagged hole in the wall. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He shone the beam into the void. The light cut through the dust and landed on something that sparkled. It wasn't a rat's eye. It was a sequin. Thousands of them. Inside the narrow, vertical niche between the subway wall and the bedrock, a figure was slumped. The dry, cool air of the tunnel had preserved her in a macabre state of mummification. She was wearing a midnight blue evening gown that still shimmered under the flashlight beam. Her skin had turned to a leather-like parchment, tight against her bones, but the hair, dark, curled, and styled in a 1950s updo, was perfectly intact. "Mother of God," the MTA foreman whispered, crossing himself. It was Cassie Vance, the jazz darling of 1954. She wasn't missing. She had been waiting for the A-train for 70 years. "Secure the scene!" Harrigan shouted, his voice booming with a mix of horror and vindication. "This is a crime scene! Nobody touches anything! Get the medical examiner down here now!" On the platform, the reaction was instantaneous. As the wall came down, Lily let out a gasp that sounded like she was surfacing from deep water. Her body arched, and she vomited. A violent physical purging of the sickness that had plagued her. "It's gone," Lily wept, collapsing back against Clara. "The pressure is gone. The wall is open." Clara and David held their daughter, tears streaming down their faces. They weren't crying from fear anymore. They were crying from relief. They weren't crazy. Their daughter wasn't mentally ill. She was a vessel for the truth. But the discovery wasn't over. Hours later, the medical examiner's team arrived. They carefully extracted the fragile remains from the niche, placing Cassie Vance into a body bag. As they moved her, something rattled inside the dried cavity of her ribcage. It was a distinct, hard sound, clack, clack. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Aris, looked at Harrigan. "Did you hear that?" "The diamond," Harrigan whispered, remembering Lily's words. "I swallowed it. You'll have to cut me open to get it." They brought a portable X-ray machine to the platform. Standard protocol for fragile remains to check for bullets or metal fragments before transport. The image appeared on the digital monitor within seconds. There, nestled in the pelvic cavity, resting where the stomach would have been, was a dense, perfectly cut, geometric shape. It was too large to be a kidney stone. It was too symmetrical to be a tumor. It was the star of midnight. The diamond was real. The murder was real. And the little girl sobbing on the bench had solved the oldest cold case in NYPD history before she learned how to tie her shoes. Harrigan walked over to David. The detective looked 10 years older, but the weight on his shoulders was gone. He extended a hand, covered in century-old dust. "You were right, Dave," Harrigan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were right about everything. She's been there the whole time, just like Lily said, behind the gray mortar." "Night." David looked at the body bag being hoisted up the stairs. "Johnny Russo got away with it," he said bitterly. "Maybe in life," Harrigan replied, looking at the black diamond shining on the X-ray screen. "But he didn't get the girl, and he didn't get the rock. He died alone in a nursing home, probably wondering where she hid it. He spent 50 years looking for a fortune that was inside the woman he killed. Lily sat up. She wiped her mouth. Her eyes were clear now, bright, blue and childish. The haunted shadow of Cassie Vance was fading, evaporating like mist in the morning sun. "Is the lady okay?" Lily asked, her voice small and undeniably her own. Clara kissed her forehead. "Yes, baby. The lady is okay. She's going home now." "Good," Lily said, reaching for her father's hand. "I don't like the dark anymore. Can we go home too? I want to play with my dolls. Not the piano, just the dolls." The comeback was complete. The truth had clawed its way out of the dark. The Star of Midnight had been recovered, not from a thief's pocket, but from the grave of its protector. But as the news vans began to swarm the station entrance above, the real story wasn't the diamond. It was the impossible bridge between a dead jazz singer and a living child. A bridge built of memory and pain that had finally, mercifully, collapsed. The headline of the New York Times the following Sunday was not buried in the Metro section. It was splashed across the front page, displacing political scandals and international wars. The Ghost Witness. 6-year-old girl leads NYPD to missing 1954 jazz star. Below the fold was a side-by-side photograph that captured the impossible reality of the situation. On the left, the glamorous, smoky-eyed portrait of Cassandra Cassie Vance from 1954. On the right, the innocent, confused face of Lily Anderson, clutching a teddy bear outside the 50th Street subway station. But the real story wasn't in the papers. It was in the medical examiner's office, where the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle was extracted. The autopsy confirmed everything Lily had screamed about in her trance. The hyoid bone was fractured, strangulation by a ligature, likely a saxophone strap. The bruising pattern on the ribs matched the heel of a shoe. And inside the mummified remains, encased in 70 years of dried tissue like a pearl in an oyster, was the Star of Midnight. The diamond was cleaned and placed on a velvet tray. It was a terrifyingly beautiful object, a 40-carat black diamond that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. For decades, treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists had believed Johnny Russo had sold it to a fence in Havana or lost it in a poker game. The truth was far more tragic. Cassie Vance had swallowed it in her final moments, a desperate act of defiance to ensure her killer walked away with nothing but blood on his hands. The funeral took place 2 weeks later in Harlem. It wasn't a somber, quiet affair. It was a homegoing celebration fit for royalty. The Anderson family was there, standing in the front row of the historic Abyssinian Baptist Church. David and Clara held hands, exhausted but lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from their chests. Lily stood between them, wearing a simple black dress and shiny patent leather shoes. The church was packed. Musicians, historians, and locals who remembered the legend of Cassie Vance filled the pews. A jazz band stood near the altar, brass instruments gleaming under the stained glass light. When they began to play, they didn't play a dirge. They played a slow, soulful rendition of The Velvet Rope, the very song Lily had hummed in the Minnesota farmhouse. Clara tensed, watching her daughter closely. She was terrified that the music would trigger another episode, that the ghost would come back for an encore. But Lily just stood there. She swung her legs back and forth on the pew. She looked at the stained glass angels. She leaned over to her mother and whispered, loudly enough for the mayor to hear, "Mommy, my shoes are tight."
You did it.
Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a month. "We'll take them off soon, baby," she whispered back, tears pricking her eyes. The vessel was empty. The channel was closed. Lily was just a bored 6-year-old at a long church service. After the service, the procession moved to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, to a plot usually reserved for jazz legends like Duke Ellington and Miles Davis. The city had donated the space. As the casket was lowered, a mahogany masterpiece paid for by an anonymous donor, the saxophone player stepped forward for a solo. He played a single, high, mournful note that hung in the cold winter air like smoke. It was a goodbye 70 years in the making. David walked Lily up to the open grave. She held a single white rose. "Do you remember her?" David asked gently, nodding toward the casket. Lily frowned, thinking hard. She looked at the photo of Cassie Vance on the easel next to the grave. "She's the lady from the wall," Lily said matter-of-factly. "She was cold, but she's warm now. She told me she found her shoes." "Her shoes?" David asked, confused. "Yeah," Lily smiled, tossing the rose onto the casket. "She lost them when she was dancing. Now she has them back. She's going to the party." The Star of Midnight did not go to an auction house. It did not disappear into a private vault. In a move that surprised the legal experts, the distant relatives of Cassie Vance, a great niece found in Chicago, donated the diamond to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. 6 months later, the exhibit opened. It was titled, "The Heart of Jazz, The Life, Death, and Return of Cassie Vance." The centerpiece of the exhibit was the black diamond, resting on a pedestal under a spotlight. But next to it, in a small glass case, was something else. It was a crayon drawing on construction paper. It showed a stick figure of a woman with a star in her stomach, trapped behind a gray wall. And next to the woman, a little girl holding a key. The plaque read, "Donated by Lily Anderson, age 6. Back in Minnesota, the snow had melted, giving way to the green shoots of spring. The Anderson farmhouse was quiet again. The toy grand piano had been moved to the attic, replaced by a set of Legos and a bicycle. One evening, Clara was washing dishes while looking out at the yard. Lily was chasing fireflies, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. There was no huskiness in her voice, no shadow in her eyes. David walked in and wrapped his arms around Clara's waist. "She's happy," he said softly. "She's free," Clara corrected him. They watched their daughter run until she tripped over her own feet, giggling as she got back up. They knew they would never fully understand what had happened. Science couldn't explain it. Psychology couldn't diagnose it. But they knew the truth. Justice is a force of nature. It doesn't care about time. It doesn't care about death. It simply demands to be heard. And sometimes when the world is too loud to listen to the whispers of the dead, it finds the only voice pure enough to scream the truth. A child. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the grass, Lily stopped running. She looked toward the woods, cocking her head as if listening to a distant sound. For a second, Clara's heart stopped. But then, Lily just shrugged, waved at a butterfly, and ran back toward the porch. "Daddy!" she yelled. "I'm hungry. Can we have pizza?" The haunting was over. The jazz club was closed, and for the first time in 70 years, Cassie Vance and the little girl who saved her could finally rest in peace.